What happens when a quiet black woman is told she doesn't belong in first class but turns out to be a federal judge? She didn't raise her voice, she didn't make a scene, but what she did next grounded an entire plane. This isn't just about a seat, it's about dignity, power, and what silence can do when the world is watching. If you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, this story will hit you hard. So before we dive in, hit that like button, drop a comment below about a time you were judged unfairly, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. Trust us, you'll want to see how this ends. The morning air in Salt Lake City carried a sharp bite, clinging to the last patches of old snow that still lined the edges of the runway. Inside the terminal at Gate 14, passengers moved like ghosts, dragging carry-ons and half-sipping burnt airport coffee. No one noticed the older woman walking slowly near the back of the boarding line. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dressed to stand out, but she carried herself like someone who'd spent a lifetime standing her ground in rooms not built for her. Her name was Judge Amelia Bennett, 64 years old, and she wasn't just any passenger. She was a sitting federal judge from the Eastern District of Michigan, known in legal circles as the Quiet Hammer. Weeks earlier she'd delivered a blistering opinion on corporate fraud in a case that rattled 3 major industries, but today she wasn't in court, she was just trying to get home. She wore a slate gray wool coat, one button loose, and carried a battered leather satchel that sagged from decades of use. Her flats were worn but polished, and her fingers were neatly manicured. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned in a soft roll, not a strand out of place. She looked more like a retired school teacher than one of the most respected legal minds in the country. She had no security detail, no fuss. She had declined offers for VIP boarding. She preferred peace. Her seat was 2A first class, not because she demanded luxury, but because at her age cramped aisles and overhead bins were simply too much. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass, smiled politely, and waved her through. "Thank you," she said softly, walking toward the jet bridge inside the aircraft. The first-class cabin was calm, a contrast to the humming chaos behind the curtain. Leather seats gleamed under warm lighting. Amelia tucked her coat beside her and stowed her bag. She pulled out a Doggard paperback, beloved Toni Morrison's Brilliance, weathered at the edges and opened to a receipt-marked page. A few minutes passed before the seat beside her was taken by a man in his 50s, white blue suit, Bluetooth in one ear. He gave her a quick glance, then looked away. Amelia barely noticed she had spent decades being overlooked. Then came the familiar sound of clipped heels. A tall blonde woman in a crisp uniform entered the cabin holding a sleek tablet. Her name tag read Chloe Ramsey. She paused beside Amelia's seat, eyes narrowing for just a second. "Too long." "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice tight. "May I see your boarding pass?" Amelia looked up slowly, surprised. "Of course," she replied calmly, pulling the printed ticket from her coat pocket. Chloe glanced at it, then back at Amelia, her brows pinched slightly. "This is a first-class seat," she said, like she hadn't just read the seat number. "I'm aware," Amelia responded, still poised. Chloe didn't back away. "Are you traveling alone?" Chloe's posture stiffened. "There might be a mix-up. I need you to come with me so we can verify your seat assignment." A few passengers looked up. The man beside Amelia didn't. He stayed buried in his phone. "There is no mix-up," Amelia said, her tone firm but not defensive. "2A is my seat." Chloe's hand touched the top of the seat subtly, not quite a command but not a request either, a silent attempt to assert control. "Let's handle this in the back," she said. "You can return after we're airborne." Amelia said nothing more. She closed her book, marked her page, and stood. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't argue, she didn't ask why. He just walked one step after another past rows of passengers, pretending not to see. Someone muttered, "Poor lady." Probably confused. As she passed in economy, she found an empty seat near the back. She sat without complaint, her coat folded on her lap. The hum of the engines hadn't even started. Outside, a baggage cart rolled by. Inside, something shifted. She reached into her bag and opened a secure judicial app. Few knew it existed, fewer had access. She typed only a few words: "Flight 3117, Gate 14, unauthorized displacement, verify, refer." She hit send and she waited, not like someone expecting vengeance but like someone who had just fired the first signal in a much larger battle. Up front, Chloe poured sparkling water like nothing had happened. Her clipboard was gone, so was her certainty. Something didn't feel right. Back in row 3-4F, Amelia stared out the window. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, but inside her something had gone very still, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of calculation, the stillness of someone who'd seen men lie under oath and never blink. A few rows behind her a young flight attendant, black soft-spoken, paused as she passed. "Ma'am, do you need anything?" Amelia looked up, saw the kindness and smiled. "No thank you." That brief exchange settled something inside her, not everything but enough. She folded her hands, she didn't move again. Her phone screen was dark, but the message had already traveled and it had reached someone who understood exactly what it meant. The plane door thudded shut with a heavy hiss, the kind that always made people shift in their seats, conscious that there was now no way out until they were somewhere else. Judge Amelia Bennett, seated quietly in the cramped 3-4F window seat, felt the vibration of it in her bones, not fear, not frustration. Anticipation. She hadn't moved since being told to give up her rightful seat in 2A. She had simply acted, and now the system was reacting. Up front, flight attendant Chloe Ramsey moved with mechanical precision, offering drinks, checking bins, her smile plastic and stretched too tight. The calm confidence she had worn earlier was gone. She kept flashing back to the moment Amelia had stood, how effortlessly she had complied. No fight, no fuss, no escalation, but something about that silence unnerved her. It hadn't felt like surrender, it had felt like strategy. Meanwhile, Captain James Darnell sat in the cockpit with one hand resting loosely on the yoke, reviewing last-minute flight details. The hum of the radio filled the space until a distinct ping interrupted it, a message from FAA dispatch. He opened the channel and read the line, then read it again. Judicial oversight alert, flight 3117 referral received. Subject: Amelia Bennett. Status: active federal judge. His posture stiffened. "Oh, pilot," he said calmly. Pause. Pretext: notify ground crew we may have a delay. Inside the cabin nothing had changed visibly. Passengers were still adjusting seat belts, closing overhead bins, scrolling through preloaded playlists, but a silent pressure had begun to spread, like the air itself was holding its breath in the back. Amelia didn't shift. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her book untouched. She wasn't watching for signs, she didn't need to. She knew how long systems took to stir and how quickly they moved when the right name lit the right screen. 3 rows ahead, Emily Carter, a junior flight attendant barely out of training, whispered to a colleague, "Is something wrong? Why are we holding her?" Colleague Marcus glanced up. "No clue, but Chloe looks like she's about to pass out." Emily looked toward the front of the cabin. Chloe was refolding an already perfect blanket for the third time. Her clipboard was missing. Her eyes flicked toward first class, then away again. Something had rattled her. She told a passenger to move earlier, Emily said, "but I think the woman had the right seat." Marcus blinked. "You sure?" Emily nodded. "She said her name was Bennett." She didn't argue, just moved. A low chime sounded from the cockpit. Chloe's name echoed through the intercom, requesting her presence up front. She froze. Passengers looked up. Chloe gave a tight smile and pushed the curtain aside. The door shut behind her with a muted click. Inside the cockpit, Captain Darnell didn't mince words. "Do you recall the woman seated in 2A?" "Yes," Chloe replied quickly. There was a seat confusion. "Her name wasn't in the manifest under first class." "Did you verify the ticket?" I glanced at it. It matched the seat, but you still asked her to move." Chloe's mouth went dry. She didn't look like a first-class passenger. Captain Darnell's expression didn't change. "That passenger is Judge Amelia Bennett. She's presiding over a high-profile corruption case involving 3 government contractors, one of which owns a minority stake in our parent company." The cockpit fell silent. "She's filed a formal referral through judiciary channels citing unauthorized displacement," he continued. "FAA oversight has been triggered. Legal has advised we do not proceed with taxi until the situation is reviewed." Chloe's breath caught. "So we're not taking off?" "No," the captain said flatly, "and unless this is corrected publicly, this flight may not leave the gate at all." He turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. Chloe stood motionless, the roar of silence in her ears louder than any engine. When she emerged from the cockpit, her face was pale. She walked slowly as if the aisle had stretched miles. All eyes turned toward her, sensing the shift. Something had broken. She walked past row after row until she reached the very back. There was Amelia Bennett seated calmly by the window, not a strand of hair out of place. Chloe crouched slightly to meet her eye. "Judge Bennett," she said quietly, voice trembling, "it appears there was a mistake. I'd like to escort you back to your assigned seat in first class." Amelia turned her head, measured and calm. "A mistake?" Chloe nodded quickly. "Your name wasn't displayed correctly in our manifest. It's been clarified." Amelia stood slowly picking up her bag. There was no urgency in her movement, only precision. Before stepping into the aisle she added, "You said I didn't belong there." "I didn't mean you touched me," Amelia said, not angrily, just with clarity. Passengers nearby froze. It was a gesture. "I didn't." Then Amelia had already begun walking. The aisle was silent. Passengers parted instinctively, some embarrassed, others suddenly very alert. The businessman in 2B stood as she approached, cheeks flushed. "Welcome back," he mumbled. Amelia nodded, not with gratitude but with recognition. In the galley Emily Carter watched it unfold, her heart pounding. She had witnessed it all, and now for the first time she understood the weight of silence. She turned to Marcus. "If they ask, I'll give a statement." A ripple moved through the cabin. No one said it, but everyone knew it. The wrong person had been underestimated. A moment later, a tall black man in a Navy FAA jacket boarded the plane. His badge read Officer Reuben Hayes. He moved with quiet authority, clipboard in hand. Behind him trailed a red-faced airline executive and a legal liaison. He made it to the galley and turned toward Chloe. "Miss Ramsey," he said calmly, "step with me to the front galley." Chloe obeyed. "Inside, Hayes said. "We've confirmed a breach in protocol. Passenger was displaced without cause. Her seat was valid, her identity verified." "I didn't." "We were not discussing intent," he replied. "We're documenting outcome." Behind him the executive palled. "Are you grounding the flight?" Ace replied without blinking. "No, we're grounding the air at 34F." Amelia sat still once again. She opened her book but didn't read. She didn't need to. Her message had been received. This wasn't about shouting, this was about shifting the ground beneath their feet quietly, permanently. For a moment everything was still. The engine hadn't started, the wheels hadn't turned, but the plane was already in motion, just not in the way anyone expected. At 34F, Judge Amelia Bennett sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the edge of her coat neatly covering her knees. She didn't need to look around, she could feel it. Something had shifted near the cockpit. FAA officer Reuben Hayes stood firm, clipboard in hand, as the galley became a makeshift courtroom. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his voice, but the way he spoke to Chloe Ramsey, the senior flight attendant, left no room for misunderstanding. "You removed a federal judge from a seat she had every right to occupy," he said. Chloe swallowed hard. There was confusion in the manifest. Her name wasn't listed in first class. Ace's eyes didn't flinch. "You didn't check the physical ticket, did you?" She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. "That's what I thought." Behind them the airline's legal representative shifted uncomfortably, trying to stay invisible in a space where visibility had just become everything. "This flight," Hayes continued, "is now under regulatory hold. No one moves until this is documented and reviewed." Back in row 2A now reclaimed, Amelia looked straight ahead, posture straight, unmoved. She wasn't enjoying this, she wasn't smug, she was simply present, and that presence was suddenly impossible to ignore. Across the aisle the man in 2B, who earlier had buried himself in his phone, shifted uncomfortably. He'd said nothing when she was removed. Now every second of his silence felt like a weight he didn't know how to carry. Further back in the mid-cabin, whispers started trickling through the rows. "Did you see what happened? She's a judge. They made her move, not just move, they touched her." The cabin wasn't filled with outrage, not yet, but it was filled with discomfort, the kind of discomfort that comes when people realize they might have watched something wrong and done absolutely nothing about it. At the rear galley, Emily Carter, the junior flight attendant, stood with her hand gently resting on a metal tray. Her jaw was tight. She had only been on the job 6 months. She had been trained to follow protocol, to avoid conflict, to de-escalate, but what she had witnessed didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like a decision, a quiet, dangerous one, made by someone too confident that no one would question it. Emily glanced at Chloe through the curtain and then made a choice. He walked toward the front. When Officer Hayes saw her approach, he tilted his head. "Something to add, Miss?" Emily nodded. "Once I witnessed the removal, I can give a statement." Chloe, still standing rigid in the galley, flinched slightly. Ace didn't smile, but his eyes acknowledged her. "Thank you, your cooperation will be noted." A message buzzed in Amelia's coat pocket. She removed the phone discreetly. "Brown Chief Justice Randall Layton. Message: FAA has opened a file. Your referral has reached congressional channels. No further action needed from you at this time. Sit tight." She locked the screen and slipped it back into her coat. Sit tight, that she could do in the Cockpit Captain Darnold tapped the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently experiencing a minor delay due to a technical protocol check. We appreciate your patience. It was the kind of lie pilots tell to avoid panic, but the passengers already knew this wasn't technical, this was personal. Near the gate a figure appeared outside the plane, a man in a navy suit with a small DOJ pin on his lapel. Behind him stood David Larson, Senior VP of Customer Accountability for the airline, flown in last minute from Denver. When the cabin door reopened with a sharp hiss, heads turned. This wasn't routine. Larson boarded the plane like he'd walked into a deposition. He wasn't prepared for Mr. Samsey, he said, voice flat. Effective immediately. You are relieved of active duty pending conduct review. Chloe's mouth parted but no sound came. He continued, you'll collect your belongings and be escorted off this aircraft. Passengers stared. Row 3's heads all turned in unison. The couple in 4A exchanged wide-eyed glances. No one touched their phones, but they didn't need to. Everyone was recording in memory. Chloe's walk down the aisle was no longer confident, no more clicking heels, just slow, awkward steps toward consequence. As she passed Amelia, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but Chloe finally saw it. Not judgment, not fury, just truth. She kept walking in the rear galley. Emily Carter watched her supervisor disappear through the cabin door. For a moment the younger woman felt torn. That could have been her if she'd stayed silent, if she'd played safe. Be now watching Judge Bennett seated with grace that made everyone else look small. Emily knew she'd done the right thing. Later, when Larson approached Amelia, he bent slightly as though acknowledging a different kind of gravity. Judge Bennett, he said softly, if you're ready we can escort you out privately. She looked at him. Is she still employed? Larison hesitated. Suspended under investigation. That's all I can confirm they'll do, she replied. She stood slow and dignified, and this time as she moved through the aisle no one looked away, no one muttered, no one scrolled past. They watched because what had just happened wasn't a moment, it was a reckoning. Outside the aircraft gate agents stood awkwardly. Airport security held back curious onlookers. Reporters hadn't arrived yet, but the air was already humming with something bigger than press. The clip, a 15-second video of Chloe's removal, was already going viral. The caption read, this is what happens when you underestimate the wrong passenger. Back at gate B27, a woman in a tan blazer turned to her colleague, phone in hand. She's trending seat 2A, Judge Amelia Bennett. The colleague blinked. The Bennett from the Vanguard Systems trial. That's her. Inside the cabin the energy had changed. People weren't chatting, they weren't fidgeting, they were remembering. They were witnesses now, and witnesses don't forget. Amelia walked out of the jet bridge calmly. No sunglasses, no security, just presence, pure and unmistakable. A child turned to his mother. Is she famous? The mother smiled. No honey, she's important. The aircraft door hissed shut behind Judge Amelia Bennett, sealing her once again inside the pressurized stillness of Flight 3117. But this time the silence wasn't about altitude, it was about aftermath. She sat in 2A now, her rightful seat, as though she had never been asked to leave. The coat in her lap was the same. The bag tucked beneath her feet hadn't moved, but everything around her had changed, and everyone knew it. Passengers who had once looked through her now stole glances, not out of curiosity, out of reckoning. They had watched her walk to the back without protest, and now they had watched her return, not because someone granted her permission, but because the system had caught up to her. Truth crossed the aisle. The man in 2B still hadn't made eye contact. Earlier, when Chloe Ramsey removed her from her seat, he had said nothing, hadn't even shifted. Now he sat stiff, hands folded tightly, blinking more than necessary. The guilt on his face wasn't dramatic, it was slow, lingering, the kind that sticks when you realize your silence was a decision. Too near the galley, Emily Carter tried to steady her hands. She was pouring a glass of water for the judge, not because she was told to, but because it mattered. She carried the cup carefully, the ice rattling softly inside, and when she reached 2A she paused. Judge Bennett, she said gently, would you like anything else? Amelia looked up. No thank you, this is perfect. Emily lingered for just a breath. I saw what happened, she said softly. I saw all of it. Amelia met her eyes, then gave a small nod. Thank you. That was all, but it landed with weight. A quiet verdict passed from one woman to Another Emily turned to walk away more grounded than before she had chosen. Right, and for once that had been enough, but Chloe Ramsey wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was now in a holding room beyond the gate, seated stiffly beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Her blazer was folded over a chair. Her name tag had been removed. Her hands shook as she recounted her actions to an internal investigator who had flown in that morning. I didn't mean anything by it, she said. I was just trying to keep order. But even as she spoke, she knew how weak it sounded. The words felt like paper shields against a storm of consequence and the deeper truth, the part she hadn't said out loud, gnawed at her. She hadn't seen a problem with asking that woman to move until someone told her who she was. That realization didn't sting, it burned. She had built a career on routine, boarding passengers, maintaining standards, keeping the cabin in order, but now she realized something terrifying. Her instincts weren't neutral. They had been trained, taught by repetition and unchecked assumptions, and when confronted with someone who didn't fit the mental picture of first class, she defaulted to action, not inquiry. Back on board, Amelia wasn't thinking about Chloe, she was thinking about her father. He had been a chemistry teacher in Birmingham, Alabama for over 40 years, a man who never raised his voice but commanded attention by simply standing still. When white parents complained about him teaching advanced placement classes, he'd respond with quiet data. Test scores proof don't match their energy, he told her once. Match their discipline. She'd carried that lesson with her through every law school exam, every court opinion, every moment where her presence was questioned before her credentials were considered. And now at 35,000 feet it had met the test once more. In seat 13C, a teenage boy whispered to his mother, "What's a federal judge?" His mother leaned close. "Someone who interprets the law, one of the most powerful people in the country, but not like politicians, more like the last voice." "Did she do something wrong?" the boy asked. The mother shook her head. "She was treated like she didn't belong, but she did." The boy nodded slowly. "Then why didn't anybody help her?" His mother didn't answer. In the cockpit, Captain Darnell received a direct message from the airline's crisis response team. Subject: Flight 3117, passenger Bennett, FAA investigation. Open, prepare cabin for compliance inspection. Do not proceed to taxi until directed. He exhaled quietly. This wasn't going away. The usual playbook: delay, deflect, apologize. Quietly wasn't going to cut it. This wasn't turbulence, this was a mirror, and everyone on board had been caught in it. David Larson, the senior airline executive who had earlier removed Chloe from duty, remained on standby outside the gate, coordinating messaging with corporate legal inside. His phone notifications exploded. Seat 2, a justice in flight. She didn't yell. The story had spread beyond aviation news. Civil rights groups, federal law clerks, even members of Congress were now weighing in. He looked out the terminal window, eyes fixed on the plane. "What have we done?" he whispered. Amelia glanced out her own window. Chicago was still hours away, but the impact of what had happened already reached past the clouds. She reached into her coat and pulled out her phone. A new message had come in from office of the Chief Judge, 6th Circuit, confirmed FAA oversight ongoing. Requesting meeting with airline leadership. Please advise if you'd prefer public hearing or written policy proposal. She stared at the screen, then typed public always. Amelia wasn't looking for spectacle, but she wasn't interested in silence anymore either. A few rows behind her, the man in 40, a military veteran, judging by his lapel pin, cleared his throat. He leaned forward and whispered to the woman beside him, "I've been flying for over 30 years, never seen a flight stop for something like that." The woman replied, "It didn't stop because of what happened, it stopped because it was finally being seen." He nodded slowly. In 2B, the man who had watched Amelia be removed finally spoke. His voice was low. Amelia turned to him. "But you didn't." He swallowed hard. "I didn't think it was my place." She didn't smile. "Silence always feels like the safest place until it isn't." He looked down. "I'm sorry, I know," she said softly, "but what you do now matters more than what you didn't do then." He nodded, and for the first time in The entire flight he met her eyes. The cabin was still not empty, just aware of what had happened, of what hadn't, of what it meant to see someone move through injustice with composure instead of fury. This wasn't just about a seat, this was about what people assume when they see you and what happens when you challenge them without raising your voice. Outside, the sun shifted, casting a beam of light across the fuselage. Inside, every passenger sat a little straighter, breathed a little deeper. They weren't just flying anymore, they were witnesses. The hum of the engines had become a low, almost meditative sound. Judge Amelia Bennett sat in 2A, still as stone, but her mind was moving rapidly. Calculating, observing, archiving. She had seen this kind of silence before, in courtrooms after guilty verdicts, in boardrooms before firings, in dinner tables after someone finally spoke the truth. It wasn't peace, it was the quiet that came after something ruptured. Yet even in this tense, almost sacred stillness, something new was stirring. A shift, small yes, but undeniable, and it didn't come from her, it came from those around her who had for the first time decided they could no longer be still. At the rear of the aircraft, Emily Carter stood in the galley holding her tablet. Heart pounding. She had just submitted a formal statement to FAA oversight documenting what she had seen, what Chloe Ramsey had done, and most importantly what had been felt. No rage, no confrontation, just that unrelenting, piercing certainty Judge Bennett carried. She didn't yell, but Emily still heard her, and she wasn't the only one. In row 14, a woman in her 50s had just messaged her daughter, "You need to know this happened today, not 50 years ago today." In row 9, a college student opened his phone and began typing a tweet that would go viral within the hour. She never raised her voice, but the plane still stopped. Seat 2A had become more than a seat, it was now a symbol. And that very moment, somewhere 40,000 feet below, a team at the Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. gathered in a conference room. The news had reached them less than an hour ago. FAA referral code 117B, judicial flag. Passenger Bennett Amelia. They weren't discussing her removal, they were discussing what it meant. Should we open this to public testimony? Someone asked. Another official, reading from his tablet, shook his head. We may not have a choice. She's already being cited by legal scholars as precedent. This could become a landmark case in passenger civil rights in Chicago. Inside the airline's regional headquarters, CEO Matthew Kleen stood in front of a screen streaming passenger footage. One clip in particular, 15 seconds long, looped continuously. It showed Amelia returning to 2A while Chloe was escorted away in silence. The video's caption read, "Dignity doesn't have to scream to make history." It had passed 1 million views in under an hour. "We're past damage control," Clay said coldly. "We are in institutional correction territory." A younger exec raised his hand. "Sir, Judge Bennett has yet to release any personal statement." Kleen turned to him. "And that's exactly why we're still bleeding. She doesn't have to speak that silence. That's the story now, and it's louder than any apology we can write." He paused. "We need to get ahead of her." Back on the plane, David Larson, the senior airline executive, stepped into the first class cabin once again. His presence, once stiff and corporate, now came with a cautious humility. He crouched slightly beside 2A. "Judge Bennett," he said, "we've drafted a formal apology. We'd also like to offer a private meeting with our executive board upon landing. We're prepared to discuss whatever action you believe is appropriate." She studied his face, not cruelly, not cynically, just with that unshakable discernment forged from decades on the bench. "I'm not interested in handshakes behind closed doors, Mr. Larson," she said. "I'm interested in structure." Larson blinked. "Structure? Policy," she clarified. "Procedure, prevention." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "I want written guidelines, public ones, mandatory verification before seat reassignment, independent reporting channels, bias recognition, training for all crew, not just one-time modules, re-certification every year, not as a punishment, as standard practice." Larson nodded slowly, caught between relief and awe. "I'll take that to the board." "No," Amelia said, "you'll take it to Congress. I'm preparing to recommend legislative intervention, not just for this airline, for the industry." Larson's mouth opened. Then closed again. He was in the presence of someone who had no need for leverage. She already had it and she intended to use it for more than herself. This wasn't retaliation, it was redesign. Further back, a man in 5D pulled up his notes app and began typing his own proposal: bias incidents in transit, establishing accountability through federal regulation. He wasn't a politician, he was a professor, but he'd never seen institutional failure exposed so publicly, so clearly. He wanted to be part of fixing it. Emily returned to 2A with a small folded note. This was handed to me by another passenger, she said. Amelia unfolded it slowly. It read, "You reminded me who I was. Thank you for being still." There was no name. She looked out the window. Chicago was below them now, its skyline cutting sharp through a blanket of white cloud. It was almost time to land in the cockpit. Captain Darnell received his final transmission from FA. Before descent, here to proceed. Expect debrief at terminal. Document all crew. Compliance incident flagged for judiciary records. He nodded, heart heavy. It was strange, he hadn't done anything wrong, but still he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something bigger than protocol, something personal, something historic. "Esh for landing," he told the co-pilot. "This one's different." As the wheels lowered and the cabin prepared for final approach, the energy was unrecognizable from the one that had filled it 2 hours earlier. There was no mindless scrawling, no idle chit-chat, no pretense, just a kind of collective breath being held. They knew they were part of something now, and when the wheels touched down they didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they simply waited, because even though the flight had landed, the journey wasn't over. The plane had landed, the wheels had touched down, the cabin lights glowed warmly, and the usual rustling of passengers gathering their things had begun. But Judge Amelia Bennett didn't move. She remained in 2A, her seat belt still fastened, her coat still folded neatly across her lap. Around her, passengers shuffled, avoided eye contact or glanced with subtle reverence, and yet she remained centered, quiet, calculating. For most people this would have been the end of a troubling travel day. For Amelia, it was the beginning of a transformation, not in how others saw her, but in how she decided to move forward from here. He had spent a career measuring her words, moderating her presence, ensuring her actions would never give someone an excuse to discount her intellect, her position, or her right to exist where she was. But something had shifted in her during this flight, a quiet fire, not rage but resolve. Across the aisle, the man in 2B finally turned to her. "I hesitated," he said, voice low, eyes weary. "When she made you move, I should have said something." Ilya didn't speak immediately. She let him sit with it, then softly, "And why didn't you?" "I didn't think it was my place. I assumed." He stopped because the sentence embarrassed him. "You assumed I'd be fine," she said, "for him, that I'd just take it, that it wasn't your problem." He nodded, ashamed. "I'm sorry." She didn't let him off easily. "You're not the only one who stayed silent. The entire cabin did." He swallowed. "What should I have done?" Amelia turned to face him fully now, said something even just, "She has the seat. One sentence can change everything." There was no accusation in her voice, but there was weight, and he felt every ounce of it. The cabin door opened, the jet bridge was in place, people began filing out. Some nodded at her, most didn't speak, but the energy had shifted. She was no longer just a passenger in 2A, she was the center of a reckoning none of them could unsee. As she stood and gathered her bag, Emily Carter approached once more, offering a steadying smile. "Ma'am, security has cleared a private exit if you'd like to avoid the press." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "There's press?" Emily nodded. "Local, national, a few legal outlets." Of course there were. News traveled faster than people, and truth, when quiet, echoed even louder. "Tell them I'm not giving a statement," Amelia said. Emily hesitated. "Will you eventually?" Amelia looked at her. "Eventually, but not now. First I want action, not quotes." She stepped off the plane and into the tunnel where David Larson, the airline's executive representative, waited. "Once again, we're preparing a formal apology to publish today," he began, voice rehearsed. We'd also like to know if you'd be willing to meet with our senior board members privately. She stopped walking. I already told you, she said. I'm not interested in private handshakes, I'm interested in policy. He nodded, fumbling slightly. Yes, and we've actually begun drafting some procedural updates. Based on your recommendations. She raised a hand. Not recommendations, Larison blinked. Judge Bennett, I'm not speaking as your passenger, I'm speaking as a federal judge, a legal authority, and a black woman who just demonstrated on your aircraft that the system isn't designed to protect everyone equally. Larson looked down. You'll implement the changes and you'll publish them, not quietly, not in fine print, publicly as policy, and you'll do it within 60 days. Her voice never rose. That was what made it terrifyingly powerful. Larson nodded. Yes, ma'am. Amelia continued walking. By the time she reached baggage claim, the quiet war inside her had finally begun to settle, not because she had been vindicated but because she had made the system bend. She thought back to her early years on the bench, the first time she walked into chambers and a bailiff mistook her for a clerk, the law firm receptionists who asked, "Who are you here to see?" when she was the one arguing the case. The conferences where her name badge said Ms. instead of H. she'd endured, each one silently correcting when necessary but never making it a crusade. Until now. Now she understood silence might have kept her safe, but it had never made her seen. That day something inside her had refused to disappear. Quietly in her hotel room that evening she sat by the window, laptop open, notes scattered. The FAA had already requested her input on new bias protocols. The Department of Transportation had emailed twice, and a senator from Illinois had called requesting a meeting. She'd called her father before bed. "You didn't yell," he said with quiet pride, "but they heard you anyway. They planned out." "I didn't want to be heard," she replied. "I wanted something to change." He chuckled. "Baby, when people like you speak, they don't get to ignore you even when you whisper." Amelia smiled, eyes fixed on the skyline outside. Something inside her had indeed grown, not louder but deeper, the part of her that always second-guessed whether speaking up would be too much was now quiet. The part of her that once feared being labeled difficult had been replaced by something else entirely: conviction. She closed her laptop, walked into the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Not a victim, not a martyr. A woman who had finally fully stepped into the space she had long earned. Tomorrow she would begin crafting a formal proposal, a public industry-wide initiative that demanded airlines adopt federal-level passenger dignity protocols. He'd call it the two-way standard, because that seat no longer represented luxury, it represented presence, and presence when wielded with discipline could alter the air in a cabin and the direction of an entire industry. As she climbed into bed, Amelia felt no exhaustion, only clarity. She had flown quietly for years now. She was taking command of the flight plan. The podium was modest, wooden, unvarnished, nothing special. The stage barely rose a foot off the ground, and behind it hung a single American flag, still and silent, but the room it faced, that was different. Folded chairs filled the community auditorium wall to wall. There were veterans in full dress uniform, local educators with notebooks on their laps, students, clerks, flight attendants still in partial uniform, even two lawmakers seated quietly in the back row. No press cameras, no teleprompters. But everyone knew this moment mattered. Judge Amelia Bennett stood just off stage, hands loosely clasped in front of her, her breath calm and even. She wore no robe, no medals, just a dark navy suit, a soft gray scarf at her neck, and the unmistakable weight of lived truth on her shoulders. They had invited her to say a few words, but what she was about to do was more than speak. It was to complete a journey that had started in seat 2A, somewhere above the clouds, when she was quietly displaced for not looking like she belonged. A woman appeared beside her with a headset and clipboard. "They're ready for you, ma'am." Amelia nodded. Once he stepped into the light, the audience rose, not out of obligation but instinct, not because she demanded it but because she had earned it. She reached the podium, laid a single sheet of paper on top of it and looked out across the room. She didn't read, she didn't wait, she began. I wasn't planning to speak today, she said. I didn't ask to trend and I certainly didn't ask to become a story, but when the world insists on watching you have two choices. Go silent or go forward. Her voice was calm, unhurried, every word deliberate. Every breath measured. I boarded flight 3117 with a valid first-class ticket, a printed boarding pass, and a lifetime of credentials. I also boarded with a leather bag older than some of the passengers and a grey coat with no designer label. What I didn't board with was permission to be underestimated. A quiet hum passed through the crowd. The flight attendant didn't ask me to leave because I was rude or disruptive or aggressive. She asked me to leave because I didn't look like what she expected. I didn't fit the image in her mind of who deserved to sit in 2A. Amelia paused. I complied quietly, not because I agreed but because I wanted to see what would happen next, because I knew in that moment I wasn't just carrying my own dignity, I was carrying generations of silence, and I wanted to see if the system would listen, not to my voice but to my stillness. The audience leaned in. Ed system did respond eventually with oversight, investigation, apology and most important action, but the truth is I wasn't surprised by what happened to me. What surprised me was what came after. She glanced around the room, making eye contact with several attendees. People stood up, not with fists, not with rage, but with statements, with testimonies, with willingness to say, I saw it, I let it happen, I want to be better. Her gaze settled for a moment on a young black flight attendant in the third row, Emily Carter in uniform, sitting tall. This wasn't a victory, Amelia said, it was an invitation. She picked up the sheet of paper, then lowered it again. I've submitted a federal-level proposal called a Passenger Dignity Standard. It includes mandatory training for flight crews on bias recognition and passenger verification, anonymous real-time reporting for in-flight incidents, and accountability logs for any forced reassignment. A few audience members murmured support. One clapped softly, then stopped when no one joined, but Amelia wasn't looking for applause. I don't want a plaque, I want a policy. She stepped away from the podium slightly, now addressing the room more intimately. Here's what I've learned: you don't have to yell to make change, but you do have to show up, and when you do, when you refuse to shrink, to vanish, to apologize for your presence, you don't just protect your seat. She paused. You make space for everyone who comes after you. Her voice trembled slightly now, not from nerves, from purpose. I'm not here to relieve what happened on that plane. I'm here to ask you, what will you do the next time you see someone displaced? What will you say the next time someone is silenced because they don't fit your picture of belonging? Upbeat, will you pretend it didn't happen? The silence that followed was thick, intentional, heavy with self-reflection. Amelia breathed in slow and deep. You don't have to be a judge to deliver justice, she said. You just have to be present, and sometimes present is enough. She gave a final nod, then stepped back. The room rose again, but this time it wasn't out of respect, it was out of recognition. They hadn't just heard her, they'd seen her. She walked off stage quietly, her footsteps steady, her shoulders relaxed behind her. People didn't rush out, they stayed, they talked. A cluster of young law students discussed case precedent. A veteran shared his own story of being profiled. A mother hugged her teenage daughter a little tighter, and somewhere in a small side room just beyond the auditorium, Amelia sat for a moment alone. She looked down at her phone. A text had come in from her father. You didn't ask to carry the torch, but you held it high. I'm proud of you. She smiled, a quiet, tearless smile, the kind that only comes when something in your soul settles. She replied, I didn't want the spotlight, but maybe it found me for a reason. She stood, straightened her scarf, and stepped back into the hallway where two staffers from the Department of Transportation waited with folders labeled Amendment Draft and Senate Testimony Brief. She accepted both, not because she wanted power, but because she now understood what it meant to own it. C2A had never been about the cushion or the view or the service. It had been about presence, and presence, when backed By principle becomes permanence in a world that often prizes noise over nuance and spectacle over stillness. The story of Judge Amelia Bennett offers a powerful reminder: real strength doesn't always announce itself, it simply endures, acts, and inspires. For older adults who've lived through seasons of change, quiet discrimination, and the ongoing fight for respect, this story is not just about one moment on a plane, it's about a lifetime of navigating systems where your worth is constantly weighed by appearances, not merit. Judge Bennett, when wronged, did not shout, she didn't demand attention, she simply acted with grace, certainty, and quiet resolve, and the world had no choice but to adjust around her. Her silence was not weakness, it was a choice born from discipline, shaped by experience and grounded in the wisdom that true change doesn't always begin with protest signs or raised voices. Sometimes it begins with a woman refusing to be unseen. Many in their later years have learned that speaking loudly doesn't always make people listen, but presence, lived truth, and integrity do. That's the heart of Judge Bennett's story, the understanding that dignity is not something you ask for, it's something you carry with you regardless of how others treat you. Moreover, this story reveals something many elders understand intimately: change doesn't always come fast, but when it does come, it often begins with the smallest moments: an unfair glance, a quiet dismissal, a seat denied. And how we respond to those moments determines not just how we are remembered, but how the world around us grows. Judge Bennett chose not just to defend her seat, but to turn that experience into a larger opportunity for reform, for accountability, for a new standard that ensures no one else has to endure what she did in silence. That is legacy, and that is something anyone, regardless of age, can still build. To the elderly reader, you've lived long enough to know that battles aren't always won with fire, sometimes they're won with patience, precision, and presence. You don't have to raise your voice to make a difference. You just have to keep showing up with your wisdom, your story, your quiet power, and remind the world that your seat at the table or on the plane was never up for debate. The lesson is timeless: your stillness can move mountains, your voice, when you choose to use it, can change policy, and your life experience is not a weight but a weapon against injustice. Do you think about this story? Did the ending satisfy you? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.